Hi, everyone. Welcome to Kindred Skulls. I'm Matt Freese, and I'm here with another solo pod for you today. We're going to go over the Vikings win against the Cardinals. Obviously, fantastic comeback win. A lot of fun to be on the winning end of that game. You know, some stress throughout, but came out pretty happy with it. And then we're going to go over the Vikings' upcoming game against the Atlanta Falcons, the return of Kirk Cousins to Minnesota. So it should be a lot of good stuff today. Let's dive right into it. First, we're going to start out with the Vikings offense against the Cardinals, right? And I think the main headline for the game, I'm going to have an article that comes out on Zone Coverage about this player, is Sam Darnold's play. Particularly, you know, when the Vikings were down 19-6, the Vikings were able to come back, score a touchdown, then they kick a field goal on their next drive. The Cardinals respond with another field goal to go up by 6, and the Vikings have a game-winning touchdown drive, score with like over a minute left, and the defense is able to shut the Cardinals down, right? So like Sam Darnold's play in those 3 drives was absolutely very impressive. I thought he struggled a little bit early in the game. He had a couple turndowns, and he was holding on the ball a little bit. I think he was kind of responsible for 1 or 2 of the sacks early. There was a lot going on with those sacks. I don't get into it probably in a little bit here. But, you know, I thought he had those issues early, but I really thought that he turned it on at the end of the game. And there were some really impressive, like, layered throws over defenders. You know, earlier in the game, there was one to Justin Jefferson over the middle where he gets it right over a linebacker and in between a couple of players. There was one where he fired it in between the hands of 2 other players, and I think that was another Jefferson play where he's on a deep curl. Obviously, some of the trust with Jefferson on that one comeback route Jefferson ran where he came back to the ball, and you know, Greg Olsen kind of highlighted that one on the broadcast. I thought he did a pretty good job showing just how far Jefferson came back from the ball. There was a throw to Addison on a corner route that was right over a defender, really kind of perfect placement there. So I thought Sam Darnold was operating at a really, really high level, just in terms of his ability to see the field and read the field. And this is really like the 3rd week in a row. I would say I think Darnold's had a very good game. He had a bit of a lull there, right, against the Colts and the Cardinals specifically. And really, if you want to turn it into like the Vikings had kind of a 4-week lull on offense against the Rams, Lions, Colts, and I'm sorry, not the Cardinals, the Jags, right? Where Sam Darnold threw 2 picks in the Colts game, he threw 3 picks in the Jags game. And even though I'll say I thought they did pretty well on offense against both the Lions and the Rams, like there were ups and downs, but there weren't any major like errors to me. The Colts and Jags were really the low point on offense and the low point from Darnold from the season. And I really kind of felt like at that point, the season could have turned negative on Darnold, right? Like he was maybe turning back into a little bit of a pumpkin. And, you know, he's really just turned it around the last 3 weeks. I thought he had a fantastic game against the Bears a week ago. And even though he had 2, I kind of talked about it in the pod last week, but even though he had 2 interceptable passes in that game, I didn't really think they were truly interceptable passes. And he had a phenomenal game against the Titans the week before that. The Vikings didn't score. Well, they weren't a world beating team, but I thought Darnold was really operating at a high level. And I think that's true again of the Vikings offense against the Cardinals. The offense stalled out a little bit. And I think maybe Darnold's still taking a few too many sacks, right, on the season, for NFL quarterbacks. If I pull it up here, he is currently 5th in total sacks taken, right? His sack rate is still pretty high. It's like 6th, right? So he is taking an incredible number of sacks. The only people with a higher sack rate than him are Will Levis, Deshaun Watson, Caleb Williams, Jacoby Brissett, and Jalen Hurts, right? Not exactly guys who are great necessarily against pressure, or, you know, younger quarterbacks who are holding onto the ball way too long, right? So Darnold is holding onto the ball a little bit too long, in my opinion. A lot of that is the design of the offense, but I think on his sacks, and I kind of break it down on Blue Sky now, like week after week, of who I think is responsible for certain sacks. And I think Sam's been responsible for a number of them, just in terms of how long he's holding onto the ball. But Sorry, I started this out complimenting and then I kind of went into a rabbit hole, caveating, one of the things I think is maybe still an issue with Darnold. But I think outside of taking sacks, like I have zero complaints about how Sam Darnold's playing quarterback. I think he might be playing quarterback like one of the top quarterbacks in the league if you remove kind of the sack problem, right? So that's what I'm trying to get to say, like, the only thing that's holding him back from being like a top 10 performing quarterback right now, or maybe even better than that, right? Like a top 5 performing quarterback, which is ridiculously high praise, I have to admit, is the fact that he's taking sacks. So really, really happy with Sam Darnold's performance in this Cardinals game. Thought he did a really good job, kept the offense on time, kept the offense on schedule, had a really important play on the 4th down conversion, was just operating at a really high level mentally during that stretch. So I was really impressed with Darnold in that situation. So if I go a bit deeper, I mentioned at the beginning, I thought he had a couple turndowns. Let me go into a couple of those plays right now. So the first one that comes to mind was the play where Aaron Jones actually fumbled on, right? So I thought he had Trent Sherfield deep on a post route, and the Vikings were running dagger, which is a clear out route by Trent Sherfield or a post route by Trent Sherfield. Usually that's kind of a token route, and then Justin Jefferson running in behind it. The thing is, the Vikings hit on a very similar concept on a very similar coverage last week for Jordan Addison to get a 69-yard catch. And Jordan Addison was on the other side of the field. I believe the Cardinals were in cover 3 on the play, if my memory of the play is serving correctly. And Jordan Addison's occupying the deep third player to that side of the field. So on the 2 receiver side, you have Sherfield and Jefferson, right? And I mentioned Sherfield's running the post. The safety is leaned over to that side towards Jefferson. He gives Sherfield an open go over the post area of the field, right? So Sherfield crosses his face and is wide open. You can lay the ball out there in basically any area, and Sherfield should be able to run it down and catch it without really interference from the defensive back. So he's wide open, and Darnold just kind of skips over him on the read, and it was a little bit frustrating, right? Obviously on the play, he was focusing on the Jefferson dig, which wasn't really open. You don't necessarily mind Sam Darnold focusing on Justin Jefferson as the first read and sticking on that a little bit on passing plays. But you do mind it when he misses massive opportunities, right? So checking down on that play isn't like the worst option in the world, but it obviously led to the Aaron Jones fumble. And that part isn't Sam Darnold's fault, but he missed something that was big, and then it turns into a fumble. There's another play a little bit before that where I thought that Darnold could have progressed past Jordan Addison, who won on a double move. And if you remember this was a throw, it kind of sailed in the end zone. It was a nothing burger that was incomplete, but it was a target to Addison, and it ended up being in double coverage. So Jordan Addison is running a double move. It's basically like a stop and go. And there are like 3 other players open on this play. I think TJ Hawkinson was running a, China return, or I forget what the name of the route is, but basically it's an outside breaking route that returns inside. So sorry, it's a stick China route. So stick route, depends, is either a short curl route or an out breaking route. So stick China is you run out like you're running a stick route, right? And then you curl back in. It's a double move, could be called like a whip route or something like that. But I think TJ Hawkins wins on that, and he's the second read. So he would have been available underneath. And I think Justin Jefferson is also winning on a backside dig where he's open, right? So if Darnold progresses beyond that first read, where I don't think Addison has the leverage, I think the corner plays it pretty well, and you have middle of the field safety as well, who would have been able to make a play based on where the ball was thrown on it. So like if Darnold progresses beyond that and doesn't just chuck a ball up long that goes incomplete, I called it kind of like a pseudo throwaway because I think he knew Addison didn't win. I think there's 2 routes that are open, and the Vikings might be able to get a first down. And this was their very first drive of the game where they ended up kicking a field goal, right? So you get a first down, you're already in scoring position, you get in the red zone. Maybe you can do something more to actually score. But in this case, they weren't able to move the ball beyond it at that point, I think. So that's where they ended up getting sacked, I want to say, because Darnold had no option on when they were max protecting, kind of. There were only 2 routes and they both got covered. So with all that being said, like, those were 2 misses I identified early in the game, and then he didn't miss stuff kind of in the last 3 drives of the game, right? So it's like you see him find Justin Jefferson open on kind of those deep curl routes. You see him find Jalen Nailor open in the middle of the field when he has to climb up hard into the pocket and he recognizes that Nailor is coming free. You see him find Jordan Addison over the middle of the field where he has to climb up hard in the pocket between 2 blockers that are kind of being blocked, and he identifies Addison's going to break open before he clears a linebacker, where Addison's at the number and the linebacker's on like the middle of the logo between the hashes, and Darnold sees Addison, knows he's going to win across that linebacker, and delivers the throw, kind of to the left of the linebacker, right? So it gets to Addison on time. It's a perfect in-stride throw. So really, I thought Darnold cleaned up those timing issues at the end of the game. And if I want to go over to the pass protection side of things, I think there were a couple things going on. First of all, I thought this was a Blake Brandel disaster class game. Like, Brandel did not have a good game at all. He was very slow, I would say, to react to the Cardinals' blitz looks in protections, where he's supposed to come off of a block that he is making to pick up a late blitzer from the Cardinals or a blitzer from depth from the Cardinals. And he wasn't able to do that like at all in this game. It was really kind of frustrating. He also, I thought, lost across his face a couple times in run defense, in run blocking that allowed the Cardinals to get a stop. There was the Ty Chandler run early in the game that went for a loss. And then I think there was another Cam Akers run in the 2-minute drill, that it still went for like 3 yards, but Brandel lost like basically immediately. And this was the run that went for 3 yards that ended up being the 4th and 7 later, right? That's just that series of downs. But Brandel lost immediately, and that's what caused the run to go for 3 yards as opposed to like 10 plus yards. Like, the Vikings never should have been in 4th and 7, because if Brandel makes that block, the Vikings had a ton of space down the field, and Brisner and Bradbury were going down the field to block linebackers at the second level for Akers. So just a really rough day for Brandel. And if I bring it back to a couple of the blitzes, right? So what the Cardinals were doing on their blitz looks is they would overload one side or run enough threats to one side to force the Vikings to slide to that side to protect it. And then they would have 1 or 2 of those guys drop out and they would blitz the rest from the other side. So on the protection for the Vikings offensive line, usually it was to the right. So I'll give an example of kind of like a half slide offensive line, right? So if you half slide, you're putting Bradbury, Risner, and O'Neal. And usually they didn't, it kind of depended whether or not they had a tight end, but Bradbury, Risner, O'Neal, and in this one case that I'll highlight, right? And this is the, I think it's the Mac Wilson sack where live, I kind of blamed Akers for not taking the most dangerous man. Afterwards, I thought that, maybe it was actually on kind of Darnold for not throwing hot, but we'll get into it a little bit here. So, like I said on the play, you have 7 rush threats from the Cardinals, and you only have the back end in protection. TJ Hawkins is attached, so you can only have 6 players blocking, right? So you've got the 4 guys on line of scrimmage. You absolutely need to block those, and then you can only block 2 of the 3 guys who are in the box. So the Vikings kind of decide to slide to the right, half slide to the right, where Bradbury, Risner, and O'Neal are going to slide to the right, and then they have Akers looking at the 2 other rushers to the right, and he's kind of responsible for picking up the one that comes. But what Akers really needs to do on this play, in my opinion, is kind of have a duel to the rusher to the left, who's Kaiser White, who ends up getting the sack on the play, and one of the rushers to the right? So you define who you're sliding to on the right-hand side. You're saying, we're going to go up to the linebacker. If and then the running back has to choose between the safety potentially coming free or the linebacker on the other side coming free, right? Because Brandel and Robinson on the other side are kind of manned up on their 2 guys. They can't get over to block the linebacker blitzing. What Akers does in this case is he goes over to the right, and I believe he's reading between Wilson and the safety. So both Wilson and the safety come, he blocks them. But in this case, White coming through the A-gap is the most dangerous man to me, who Akers should have been reading, but he wasn't reading at the sack. at the snap. So White's coming right into Darnold's face and he can't get the ball off. He ends up taking the sack. There was Jordan Addison coming open over the middle of the field, kind of as a hot route to replace White. So I ultimately kind of would have liked Darnold to throw this as a hot route, right? But it's hard because you have pressure directly through the A-gap. That's like the fastest path to the quarterback. And it's hard for Darnold to even get the ball out in that kind of time. So I can kind of see why he didn't get it, but I also am frustrated that he didn't get it out, right? There were other instances though where Brandel struggled, and what he particularly struggled with was when a player was over him as a defensive tackle and kind of rushed to the outside, and then the linebacker attacked after that. So the play I'm thinking of, I think, was the Mack Wilson sack, where you have a defensive tackle right in front of him. The line is again sliding to the right because they send threats to the right. And in this case, those threats drop out. So Garrett Bradbury does a very heads up move of coming back over to the center and helping Brandel block the defensive tackle on this play. When Brandel notices that he has help, he should have his eyes up and see the blitzer, Mack Wilson, that's coming and get off of that block, and let Bradbury take that block over and then go to help block, Mack Wilson and help protect Sam Darnold. He doesn't do that in that case. So like that was certainly a frustration. As I mentioned, there were 0 blitzes where the Cardinals overloaded, where the Vikings needed hot answers. And I do think they came up with a hot answer on the final 4th down of the game that I thought was pretty impressive. So that was another blitz by the Cardinals. And what the Cardinals have been doing is similar to what the Vikings do on defense, right? I've talked about this with the Vikings cover 0 and their tag pressures all the time, where they threaten blitz and then they drop back into the hot zones where the quarterback wants to throw the ball, right? So if you're the Vikings and you see a blitz, you may think, okay, my best answer as a hot route is actually to where the unblocked blitzer is, right behind him. But the Cardinals have droppers into those zones on that 4th down, right? So if you watch the play, the droppers are going from the right side of the line, right? So the Vikings are protected to the right, but they're also hot to the left, right? Darnold has an unblocked rusher based on the Vikings protection coming on his left. So when the 2 players on the right drop, he should see the unblocked rusher coming on his left, and traditionally you throw hot to replace where that unblocked rusher is coming from. But those 2 droppers on the right-hand side are trying to cover that window on the left to take away any quick hot options. It's 4th down. Obviously, they want to force a quick throw, and they want that quick throw to be incomplete, or they want to have somebody in the area of the quick throw. So what the Vikings did is they kind of understood that what the Cardinals were doing was overloading one side of the protection, then dropping those players out and sending a blitz from the other side. By the very end of the game, right? They struggled. That's why Sam Darnold got 5 sacks. They struggled to identify that early in the game, but I think they got it figured out by the end of the game. So they ran a co-route with Justin Jefferson to the side of the 2 droppers because those droppers were naturally going to tilt towards their left where the free blitzer is going, right? You want to cover the vacated space because that's where the offense wants to throw the hot. So the Vikings kind of won the chess match where they knew that the Cardinals were going to try to cover the space they vacated by sending the blitzer. So they attacked the space that the Cardinals vacated by trying to cover the space that the blitzer was coming from, if that makes sense, right? So it was kind of a 2 steps ahead of the Cardinals where, okay, the Cardinals know philosophically you want to throw in the space the blitzer comes from. Therefore, they try to cover that space. The Vikings figured out that the Cardinals were going to try to cover that space, so they threw the space that the Cardinals were vacating by trying to cover that space. Sorry, I just said the same thing twice. I don't really have a better way to explain it than that offhand. But it was kind of an interesting chess match moment, and that's how Justin Jefferson finds so much space in that 4th and 7 moment, right? It's the most important player in the Vikings, but there's only so many players you can cover him with in this blitz. They're not doubling him. They're just trying to force the Vikings to throw hot. So, I thought it was really impressive kind of chess match win for the Vikings to convert that 4th down, and great by Darnold to be able to process that quickly, get the ball out before he gets hit, and make an accurate throw. to get it, right? The TJ Hawkinson pass interference, a play later, is kind of a similar thing where the Cardinals are sending it all on blitz again. They're running cover 0. Darnold has to find his best matchup. That's TJ Hawkinson against the safety. TJ Hawkinson wins inside. The safety has to restrict his arm, right? Darnold operating quickly against a blitz, something he wasn't necessarily as able to do early in the game, was probably what really impressed me with his turnaround. So, that's kind of a breakdown of a little bit how the Cardinals were attacking the Vikings, and then also how the Vikings ended up fighting back and winning the game and kind of with Sam Darnold, right? So, other shout out on offense, I guess, has to go to Justin Jefferson. It's just his weekly shout out for being awesome, right? The one thing that stood out to me in this game, everything stands out all the time with Justin Jefferson, right? But the coming back to the ball that Greg Olsen highlighted, I wanted to highlight once again. I think he was down at the 15-yard line and came back all the way to the 20-yard line and really to like the 22-yard line, right? So that's 7 yards of coming back to the ball on that one curl that he just barely caught. So just really impressive veteran savvy in doing that. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight was a play where he didn't even get the ball. I think Darnold ended up throwing the ball to the left and it was completion, but maybe it was on the Johnny Munt catch very early in the game, but Jefferson breaks so flat on his route, right? So he has a corner in roughly man coverage on him, and he runs an in route where he breaks right along the 50-yard line or 45-yard line or something like that. And he is flat to that 45-yard line the entire time. The corner in trying to turn with him is 3 yards off of him. So Jefferson with his break created 3 yards of separation on that play. And it's just absurd. And it's kind of ridiculous the year we're seeing from Justin Jefferson, because he's not putting the eye-popping numbers off that he has, in previous years. Obviously, he's gone over 1,000 yards in 12 games. So maybe that's not exactly true, but like, he's not leading the league in receiving, right? That's Ja'Marr Chase. He is second in receiving, but it just doesn't feel like we're seeing the same pace from Justin Jefferson as we have in previous years. And this is a guy who's averaged like 97 yards per game for his career. So obviously getting, only taking 12 games to get to 1,000 yards instead of 11 or instead of 10, right, is kind of maybe a little bit of a disappointment for him, but it's not his fault. Like, we kind of went over last week how the Bears are covering Jefferson, but it's also like he's just consistently playing at a high level still. And it's just that the Vikings are throwing the ball less. Sam Darnold has almost 100 fewer passing attempts than Joe Burrow does on the year so far, right? It's like 90 something fewer passing attempts of what Sam Darnold has. So obviously Justin Jefferson isn't going to have as much yards as Ja'Marr Chase. Like, he's still one of the highest volume individual players based on the amount that the Vikings are throwing the ball. So really, really, really impressed with Justin Jefferson this season once again. I guess another thing to highlight is just the fun from the 2 touchdowns that the Vikings had, right? So the first one is Johnny Munt ends up wide open in the end zone. Sam Darnold, I thought, did a really good job of climbing the pocket on this play. Somebody else who I thought struggled in pass protection was Cam Akers, right? I talked about his decision to not take the most dangerous man on one of the previous pass plays, but I also kind of thought that he just struggled to execute blocks when he did get the right guys. I didn't think there were a ton of mental errors, but I just didn't think he was good at blocking opposing rushers. So like on that touchdown to Johnny Munt, Cam Akers decides to make a cut block against a linebacker, and he was too close to the quarterback to make that cut block. So Sam Darnold ends up with the trash at his feet immediately, and Cam Robinson, or maybe it was Brandel, is pushing a guy past the pocket behind him. So Sam Darnold has a player in front of him and a player behind him. He needs to escape up between them and out of the pocket to get a throw open to Johnny Munt, who is wide open. And I thought the design was nice. I think I've talked about it before, but Brandel started as a blocker and then ended up, releasing. So he kind of gets lost in the defense. And as Sam scrambles, it creates an opening for Munt. Jefferson was also open on the play on the other side. So if Darnold wasn't looking for Munt, he would have found Jefferson on the other side because of the scramble and Darnold's ability to do that on those plays. And then the second touchdown, right, the game winner, I thought was just a nice way to run mesh traffic. So the Cardinals have obviously a linebacker in man coverage on Aaron Jones. That's very typical for a red zone thing, but the Vikings started Aaron Jones out on the left side of the formation and they released him to the right. So starting Jones out on that side just gives the linebacker a little bit further to go because he kind of has to line up over Jones where he is, right? So it gives the linebacker a little bit further to go. And then the Vikings ran mesh underneath that. So if you're playing man coverage as a defense, you have two corners running with each other on mesh. So what ends up happening is Jordan Addison's coming from the right-hand side, is running across the formation, and it ends up to where the linebacker has to sidestep the corner that's covering Jordan Addison, right? And the other mesh route on the other side of the field didn't end up mattering because Jones ended up being wide open in the flat. But, those guys are typically who you want to collide, but it also affected the linebacker on this play who was covering the running back in the backfield. So it's just an impressive way to do it, an impressive way to get Jones to get the edge. And Jones gets, a touchdown as kind of redemption after the two fumbles. As far as the fumbling problem for Aaron Jones, I don't really have too much to say on that. Like, I think Aaron Jones should be the starter. He's the best back on the Vikings. I don't think that benching Aaron Jones will necessarily help him overcome his fumbling problem or anything like that, right? Like, Jones is a veteran. He clearly understands the gravity. Like, if you see him after he's fumbled, like, he clearly understands the gravity of what's happening when he's fumbling these balls. He just needs to protect the ball better. And I think, like, he will take it upon himself to be accountable and be able to do that in future games. Like, I don't think there's an attitude problem with Jones where he's just not being accountable. And that's the reason you would bench a guy, right? The thing is, he's just so much more effective of a runner. Like, he just reads blocks so much better. He's such a better pass protector. I talked about a couple of the struggles Cam Akers had in pass protection. I think that's a huge reason you want to have Aaron Jones on the field in those situations because he understands how to block. Or you can more easily send him on or out of a route. He's a more dynamic route runner too than Akers is. So to me, it's very important to keep Aaron Jones on the field. Obviously, you have to do something about the fumbles. I totally agree with benching him for a little bit of this game, right? Because you just have to bench a guy after he fumbles like that. It's just kind of the way football works. But by the same token, I don't want to see this necessarily cut into his snaps for the rest of the season, assuming he's able to kind of shake the fumble issue, because I think he's just a much better player than what the Vikings have on the rest of the offense. So if I flip it over to the defensive side of the ball, I think there's a couple themes for the game. Obviously, the Cardinals moved the ball very well. They got in the scoring position on like the majority of their drives, right? By, if I pull it up here, yeah, they got in the scoring position on, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of their, what is that? 10 total drives, right? So that's a 70% rate of getting in the scoring position. Now, one of those times they were gifted the ball on fumble, right? So let's say it's 6 of 9, but that's still a really, really crazy rate. And to me, the way they did it was just by dinking and dunking down the field. There were just so many plays where Kyler Murray was able to take the easy stuff underneath, right? Find a quick receiver underneath, get 5 yards, live to fight another down. And I think ultimately the Vikings are fine with that. When you're living that way on the offense, it becomes difficult to score in the red zone because and people say this, the defense tightens up. Literally the field compresses. You can't attack deep as much. So it's a lot easier to rally and tackle on the short stuff when you're within the 20-yard line than it is in the middle of the field because your safeties are a lot closer to the ball, right? So you have more players closer to where the player catches the ball. It's a lot easier to tackle them, right? And bring the guy down for a limited gain. So I don't really know if there was much of a coverage switch up. I'm going to get to the amount of man coverage that the Vikings ran in the game, but I thought it was just, literally the Vikings, because you were able to tighten up the field, were able to shut them down. So the Cardinals kind of turtled a little bit on offense, in my opinion, right? They only kind of dinked and dunked their way down the field with the exception of the one drive where they ended up scoring the touchdown. And because they dinked and dunked their way down the field, they weren't able to actually put the ball in the end zone once they got in scoring position. So to me, I think it was a little bit of a win from the Vikings defensive game plan. Obviously, you wouldn't like your opponent to run that many plays or put up that much yardage. I think a lot of credit should go to the Cardinals because they were able to, consistently trickle the ball down the field, without making mistakes. I also think that the Cardinals ran the ball a lot better than they had in previous weeks, and than any other team really has been able to against the Vikings. I think they were more successful than the Lions were running the ball against us. Like, maybe from a total yardage perspective, the Lions outran us, but they outran what the Cardinals did. But that's because the Lions had so many explosive plays, or at least the one big explosive play to Jahmyr Gibbs. For the Cardinals, it was really just a consistent grind of successful plays, which is mostly what the Vikings have done running the ball on offense. But I was really impressed with what their run game was able to do as well. So, certainly not the best performance the Vikings defense has put on this year. But I think the way the Vikings played the game, they wanted the Cardinals to check down consistently throughout the game, and they kind of got what they wanted from what they were doing. So I don't think it was a major loss on defense either. I do think the Cardinals run game highlighted something that the Vikings have a problem with. The successful runs for the Cardinals, and most of the runs the Cardinals were trying, were attacking Jerry Tillery directly. So the way the Vikings were setting their front, and the way the Vikings have set their front, and this game was a little bit unique because, again, I'm going to get into the man coverage that they played, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the Vikings were playing single high a lot, and I think they were doing so single high pre-snap presentations a lot. And I think they were doing so because of the concern with Kyler Murray as a run threat, right? When you have a run threat at quarterback, it changes the math in the run game. When you play single high, you want to, it's to help limit the run. It puts an extra body in the box. That means there's one more player on defense in the box than there is blockers. So you're doing that to help limit the run. It helps you a lot against the quarterback run game. And the Cardinals didn't use the quarterback run game heavily. They were a little bit successful on at least one of the plays that they did use it. But, they were still successful running into heavier boxes from the Vikings, right? And they were able to keep heavier personnel on the field from the Vikings, by which I mean 3 defensive tackles, or sometimes 4 defensive tackles, Harrison Phillips, Jonathan Bullard, and then Jalen Redmond, who had a freaking awesome game, right? He had the 3 tackles for loss, just absolutely incredible knifing to the backfield. But Jalen Redmond and also Jerry Tillery. So when they had four guys, it was usually, those 4, or you take Redmond off and it's just 3 guys in Tillery, but you still have 2 edge rushers. So that's a 5-man front. That's like a pretty heavy front from the defensive side of the ball. And Jerry Tillery was, I would say, light in that front. They were down blocking a lot. They were attacking with power, or they were double teaming him, and they were getting movement and opening holes in both cases against him. So, the Vikings would bring a safety down in the box, whether that's Cam Bynum or Harrison Smith. A lot of times, and this is something we've seen a bunch of previous weeks, the Vikings will blitz that guy off the edge, right? And you end up getting 2 blitzers outside the tackle or outside the tight end on one end. And that can be a problem against the run. The 49ers were able to get them a couple times on this, where they were blitzing on the backside, and the 49ers just had a run call to the other side. It got a couple successful runs, right? So that worked for the Cardinals as well. But the way the Vikings set the front, the safety coming down in the box, not Josh Metellus, right? Josh Metellus was often over Tillery, actually. Right. So the side the safety was opposite the side that Tillery is. So they can run at Tillery, and then the extra support in the run game, right? The safety isn't to that side. They're actually doubling from Tillery up to Metellus, who are probably the 2 weakest players in terms of taking on blocks in the Vikings front. So the ability to do that by the Cardinals, I think, really helped spring their run game, right? And they were able to be physical against Tillery, who I've credited a lot for playing pretty well against the run, but he just struggled in this game. And I think he's going to struggle against larger offensive linemen. That's not his game. He's more of a quick player who uses penetration to win, right? The guys you want holding up to double teams are Jonathan Bullard and Harrison Phillips. So if you continue to see this issue, where opposing offenses recognize that Tillery is a weak point and attack him in a run game, you might want to flip how you do the fronts, or maybe different teams won't be as personnel heavy as what the Cardinals were, so you can get Tillery out of the game a little bit more in those situations. Or maybe you want to just use Redmond for him, because Redmond seemed to be better in terms of penetration, although to my point, Redmond's penetration plays and those negative plays were typically he was on the one side of the offensive line and the run was to the other side, right? So he was able to beat the opposing lineman across his face and get in the backfield to make those plays rather than being necessarily run right at. So I'm not sure how he might hold up to the point of attack in that case either. So, kind of hopefully an interesting tidbit there in terms of how I thought the Cardinals were so successful on the ground. I think James Conner's a really good back, and he was working very hard after contact as well, right? Always falling forward, getting positive yards. Not everybody's able to do that, but the Vikings are facing another very good back next week with great contact balance and good power in Bijan Robinson. So it's not like, that's going away, for their next opponent. But if we flip it over to the coverage side of things, the thing that absolutely stands out from this game, and the broadcast highlighted it a ton, was the Vikings' heavy man coverage usage. So I charted it, 54 total pass or dropbacks from the Cardinals. I eliminated the play where Kyler threw the ball late and it was an ineligible man downfield because I didn't really define the coverage on that one because it was a quarterback draw. So 54%, that's 29 of 54 total dropbacks from the Cardinals. Just an absolutely crazy rate. The most the Vikings had run man coverage prior to this was against the Jets. They ran 15 times or 26% of the time in that game against the Jets. So this was more than double that, right? This doubled their previous man coverage usage, and it actually increased their total man coverage usage on the season. I went through all my charting numbers and did it from 17.5% to 21%. So it increased the amount of man coverage the Vikings used in this game, increased their total man coverage by like 25% over the season, by almost 4%, right, over the course of the season, which is absolutely crazy. Like it was a totally different game plan from what we've seen from them. And I talked a little bit about how the Vikings clearly in this game wanted to be in one high for most of the game to take away the designed QB run threat. Now, interestingly, playing man coverage is usually bad against scrambling quarterbacks because it gives them the ability to just take off with your back turned, right? When the defense has its back turned to them. And Kyler got the Vikings on a couple big scrambles in this game where they were playing man coverage. But the thing I think was interesting is the way the Vikings really wanted to attack the Cardinals was to rush 5 pretty much all game and play man behind it. And, I'm not sure it worked necessarily. Obviously, Kyler did have a couple big scrambles and they were able to consistently move the ball, but it is clearly what the Vikings identified as what they thought was their best path to win this game, right? So they ran cover 1 blitz at least 9 times. My sample might be a little bad because I realized later, which I thought was an interesting wrinkle, is that the Vikings often were kind of showing too high pre-snap, but then would bring a safety down in the box like it's Robert. But what that safety is doing actually at the snap is immediately going to cover the running back. So the Vikings are rushing 5. They have man coverage with 1 deep defender and just 5 players in man underneath in those situations. So they ran that like over 10 times, right? Like at least 20% of the game where they're rushing 5. And I think what they thought they could do is use their rush plan with 5 players, which is a lot better than 4, to contain Kyler and prevent him from escaping the pocket. And really, he only got out of the pocket twice, right? So it's kind of one of those things where he only got out of the pocket successfully twice. He had a couple other scrambles for like 1 yard or like 3 yards or something like that on the final drive. He had 5 total scrambles in the game, but only 2 went for more than 10 yards. So I think they were relatively successful. It's just the thing is, they weren't necessarily able to hold up in man coverage against quick throws, or at least against Trey McBride as a tight end, right? That's why McBride ended up with 12 catches, even if it only got like 100 yards or something on those 12 catches. And they struggled a little bit once Fabian Moreau got in the game to cover Marvin Harrison. But overall, I think, from the Vikings game plan, they wanted to contain Kyler by rushing 5 and using a rush contain plan to kind of crush the pocket and defeat him and prevent him from escaping. That generally worked. There were a couple mishaps. They didn't necessarily respect the Cardinals' receiving options, which is why they were playing man coverage. That worked against everybody but Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride, right? there were blemishes there, especially against McBride. So with McBride, he was just better than Josh Metellus, who was in man coverage on him most of the game. In some cases, it was Cam Bynum, who was in man coverage on him, right? So I think that's a little bit of a concern if you're the Vikings and you get a good tight end. They can't necessarily man up against him, especially on those shorter routes. And then the other thing is obviously the injury to Stephon Gilmore, right? So Gilmore leaves this game with a hamstring injury. It's not exactly clear how long-term the injury is at this point. You know, hamstrings, if they're bad, if they're like a true like strained hamstring, you know, you're going on IR. That's what Ivan Pace did. That's what Justin Jefferson did last year. You know, and corner is a position where you absolutely need that hamstring to be full strength, and you need to be able to accelerate as quickly as possible and run top speed, right? So for an older player like Gilmore, it's imperative that he gets healthy. But Kevin O'Connell also said after the game that they thought maybe Gilmore could come back in during the course of the game. So maybe it was just a little bit of a tweak, and he'll be back and fine next week. We're probably not going to get a ton of clarity through the injury report just because Gilmore's an older player and they'll probably play it safe with him, but it'll be interesting. That meant that Fabian Moreau had to enter the game, and the Cardinals attacked him relentlessly throughout the course of the game. He held up on a number of plays. Like, I thought the first pass interference against Moreau was complete BS. I thought he was in good coverage in phase there. But he had an absolutely disastrous pass interference penalty that converted a 3rd and long and got the Cardinals in the scoring range. And then they ran another route in man coverage, and Marvin Harrison beat him for a touchdown. I will say notably on both of those plays, the Vikings are running what I'll call so on the first play, they were actually running 2 double teams. They double teamed Marvin Harrison and they double teamed, Trey McBride on that 3rd and 9. And it left a 1-on-1 for Zay Jones, who was the one who forced the holding penalty, against Moreau, right? So Moreau's in a tough spot there because typically against a deep post in man coverage, you will have inside help. He doesn't have inside help. He has to cover his guy all the way around the field. He gets beat inside by Jones. It's a rep you have to win as a corner, but it's a really, really difficult ask, especially for a guy who is a backup heading into this game, who hadn't played like any snaps on defense. I think he'd gotten 1 or 2 in previous games. And then the second play was what I'll call one double buzz. So that's where you have, instead of it being 2 deep zones from the safeties, in 2-man, double buzz is 2 kind of underneath hook zones for the safety. And it's a red zone coverage where it brings the safeties down kind of to prevent shorter throws, right? You're not worried about getting beat over the top in that situation. So you're kind of down in the middle to take away crossing routes, which teams love to run. And I mentioned, the Vikings scored a touchdown in that mesh, right? So this helps take away mesh in kind of those man coverage scenarios. That means that the deep corner route to the outside by Marvin Harrison is 1-on-1 and Moreau doesn't help, and he loses. There's a really nice throw over the top, right? It was not terrible coverage, but it wasn't great coverage, and Moreau lost on a couple other refs for Marvin Harrison. So at the end of the day, he struggled a little bit. It's definitely a concern if he has to play a significant amount of time and Stephon Gilmore's out. But he also wasn't a complete disaster, right? I think the touchdown and the penalty may lead to him seeing like he had a really, really bad game. He just had a bad game. And obviously giving up a touchdown and a penalty isn't good. But for a backup, it wasn't the worst performance. I think if I'm the Vikings, I don't want a game plan to play nearly as much man coverage and leave Moreau on an island like that moving forward. So we'll kind of see how Gilmore pans out and how we'll treat it. But I think the Vikings put Moreau in a really tough spot with what they were asking him to do. And he played well enough for the Vikings to win the game, obviously. So it wasn't the end of the world. So overall, up and down performance, but at least happy that the Vikings had somebody they felt confident enough in that they didn't have to completely change their game plan, and run something completely different to get him, on the field or to kind of try to hide him on the field. So that's kind of that for the defensive side of the ball in the Cardinals game. Now I'm going to flip it over to the Falcons game. Obviously the headline Everybody knows Kirk Cousins is returning to the Minnesota Vikings. The Falcons are currently in the lead in the NFC South. They are tied with the Bucs, but they own the tiebreaker. They beat the Bucs twice. So they are in the lead. They kind of have a 1-game advantage on the Bucs, right? So the Falcons, kind of reeling after a 4-interception Kirk game, really need a bounce back win against the Minnesota Vikings. It kind of sets the stage for an interesting matchup, right? And from a Kirk perspective, he just had a 4-interception game. He's in a lull. He's thrown 0 touchdowns and thrown 6 interceptions in his last 3 games, all of which I think are Falcons losses. It's like a negative end of the streak, but we've seen this from Kirk before, where he goes on streaky bad games and then he goes on streaky awesome games. So it'll be interesting to see if he's able to bounce back, and has a little bit of extra juice coming back against the Vikings. I don't think he necessarily has ill will against the Vikings, but I also think he wishes the Vikings would have committed to him longer term, right? Rather than having moved somewhere else. So there's probably a little bit of motivation that Kirk can pull there. And from the Vikings, you want to beat Kirk Cousins, right? You want to beat your former quarterback, and you want to prove that you were right to move on and that you're happy with Sam Darnold. So I don't know if the players have that feeling as much as maybe the front office does, but it's certainly intriguing, right? Because I've talked a lot about how quarterbacks who operate quickly, on time, and can diagnose the Vikings coverages are going to be able to move the ball against the Vikings. I don't know if I'd put Kyler's game in that category, although I thought he did have a really good game, and I don't think the interceptions really sell it. By the way, the interceptions, I mean, obviously the second one was just kind of a desperation heave where you had great coverage from Shaq Griffin and man coverage. The first one, again, was kind of a rush plan, got Kyler discombobulated. He threw the ball up. I actually thought Murphy kind of lost on a crossing route. And again, it was man coverage on that play. The Vikings were running their 1 blitz. So they had a deep safety. Murphy didn't really have help on the crossing route. He allowed a little bit of separation, but the rush made Kyler move off of his spot. I actually thought Kyler kind of did a bad job of managing the pocket there too. Where he stepped to his left immediately and ended up kind of turning around due to pressure. Didn't really know where his receiver was and heaved the ball up to Murphy. So it was kind of a gift pick in both scenarios. I guess, jumping back to the defense, I should also just highlight the incredible effort from Jonathan Grenard on that final drive, right? So you had the first play was just a quick completion. Then the strip sack was just an absolutely phenomenal speed rush by Grenard, where he's able to turn the corner, hit Murray's hand, knock the ball down. It ends up creating a fumble. And then the third down play, Murray was only able to scramble for like 3 yards or something like that. Also caused by Grenard. Pat Jones wins immediately on that play, forces Murray to step up and kind of go out of the pocket. Grenard chases him down. It's only a 3-yard gain, right? I talked about how the Vikings are running heavy man coverage and blitzing a ton. In order to corral Kyler, you need those guys to have a good rush plan and chase those guys down. The angle and the effort from Grenard is what prevented that from being like a 10 or 15-yard gain, right? So that just an impressive pound drive as well. But back to Kirk Cousins, the reason I got on to Kyler a little bit again was because the players that have beaten the Vikings are the ones who can diagnose the coverage and consistently make accurate throws. And smart throws. That was Jared Goff. That was Matthew Stafford. That sounds like Kirk Cousins, and Kirk Cousins has the advantage of having played against this defense for an entire offseason. He probably knows some of the tells of what the Vikings are trying to do on defense. And I think they've changed it up a little bit this year. Obviously, they're running a ton more man coverage, but he might have a better understanding of the most of what the Vikings are trying to do. By the same token, the Vikings on defense have a better understanding of what Kirk Cousins likes to do and how he likes to respond to certain looks and certain coverages and all that stuff. So it'll be a really interesting chess match in terms of who's able to get who. I think another, discussion point around Kirk is his lack of ability to move. There's been a lot talked about how the Falcons haven't run rollouts this year. Kirk really has no mobility in the pocket coming off of the Achilles injury. He's probably not fully mobile again. So that'll be a really interesting standpoint because if Kirk doesn't have the ability to move, I mean, he's kind of dead to rights in the pocket. It's going to be hard to cover the Vikings blitz looks, but even then they have the guys to win on the inside. So if he needs to stay on his spot and he's not able to move off the spot, I expect to see a number of sacks from the Vikings defense, unless Kirk is able to get the ball out really quickly. So the man coverage changeup might be an answer there, right? Because if you think you can man up for long enough to actually get pressure on the quarterback, I don't see why you don't just do that. Now that leaves you open to somebody like Kyle Pitts, defeating your guys who aren't great in man coverage at the safety position from Metellus or Bynum, right? They ended up losing pretty consistently to Trey McBride in the game, or Drake London, right, who's a great ball winner, one-on-one. I don't know if the Vikings have a corner who could match up with him, especially with Stephon Gilmore out. So there's certainly risk from playing man coverage, but I wouldn't be shocked to see it from the Vikings again because the quarterback can't move in this case. Otherwise, their zone coverages, it's just you have to cover long enough to get to Kirk. And they might be able to do that. But even outside of the passing game, the Falcons have a fantastic running back in Bijan Robinson. I don't know. Again, the Vikings, I thought, played probably more one high because they were worried about the quarterback run threat. I don't think that's going to be the case in this game. So they're probably going to be looking at more two high pre-snap. But you still need to be able to stop Bijan on the ground. And I talked about a way the Falcons could potentially attack that. I'll be interested to see if they think that's a good idea as well, going after kind of Tillery in the run game, putting more personnel in the box. I don't know what their personnel usage tendencies are, but it'll be kind of interesting to see how they decide to attack the Vikings. But at the end of the day, to be honest, I expect the Vikings to kind of shut down the Falcons run game. They've been a phenomenal run defense all year. And the only time they've been beaten is when they have an absolutely incredible speed back in Jahmyr Gibbs, or when the opponent has a quarterback rushing threat like Kyler Murray. Those are the two times. And I do think the quarterback rushing threat matters. So I'm not sure that with Kirk's lack of mobility, Bijan is going to be able to do much. The Falcons do have a pretty strong offensive line across the board. It's been pretty good for a couple of years now. And they're particularly good in the run game. Caleb McGarry isn't much of a pass protector, but he's a pretty good run blocker. So, if there's a team that can do it, the Falcons are certainly one of them. But we'll just kind of have to see how it plays out. If we flip it over to the defensive side of the ball, I think their defense really lacks star power up front. I think the Falcons are once again last in sacks across the NFL, which they've been 5 times in the last 10 years or something ridiculous like that. They still have Grady Jarrett, who's getting older. They have Matt Judon, who's also an older player, and I think has been dealing with some injuries over the course of the year. So they have maybe a couple more guys who can rush the passer and have that savvy than they have in previous years. But they also have, I find kind of interesting, a bunch of larger linebacker bodies in Caden Ellis, Nate Landman, and Troy Anderson. And then they have smaller edge rushers who maybe have a little bit more movement skills in Arnold Ebiketie and Lorenzo Carter. So it's kind of an interesting combination where I think the Cardinals have a lot of guys who are maybe a little bit of blitz threats. So I'd be interested to see if they try to do, some stuff in terms of simulating, and I haven't watched them really at all. So I'd be interested to see if they try to do some sort of stuff in terms of simulated pressures where they're dropping guys out and force the Vikings to communicate on the offensive line after a week where they had a terrible time communicating. But the Falcons are kind of interesting because they don't really have anybody who scares you up front. And then on the back end, I don't know if really there's the true star power on this defense, but they do have Jesse Bates, who's playing awesome and taking the ball away at a ridiculous rate. I think he has 3 interceptions and 4 forced fumbles. He had a ton of turnovers last year. He's been a really good player the last couple of years. So he's somebody you have to watch out for. And I mentioned Sam Darnold taking care of the ball. I think he's done a really good job of that recently. If somebody's going to be able to bait Sam Darnold into having turnover problems again, it's probably Jesse Bates. AJ Terrell, I think, is a good corner. I think he's a high quality starting corner in the NFL. He's better than anybody on the Vikings roster, in my opinion, but he's not somebody who's going to be able to go one-on-one against Justin Jefferson to me. So it's kind of one of those things where he'll be in his coverages and you got to make sure not to throw an interception to him, but I don't think he's going to be a shutdown player that stops Justin Jefferson. They also have veteran savvy in Justin Simmons on the back end, right? So it's like a lot of savvy players on the back end, some quality players on the back end, but really not a phenomenal defense. The Vikings, if they're able to, if the Falcons want to send sim pressures in this game, the Vikings will need to get better at communicating than what they were able to do against the Cardinals on offense, right? That led to 5 sacks of Sam Darnold. Otherwise, I think they can kind of block the Falcons straight up. I think they'll be able to run the ball on the Falcons, like they were honestly able to run the ball on the Cardinals. They just didn't have a lot of rushing attempts. And then it's just on Sam Darnold to not make mistakes, right? It's on Kevin O'Connell to draw up plays that get Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison and whoever wants to get open, TJ Hawkinson to open, right? Sam Darnold to find the open players, those receivers to execute the route and catch the ball. So avoiding mistakes on offense, again, big key to the game. Jesse Bates, kind of the scary portion of that for me. Containing Kirk Cousins or like if Kirk Cousins is a sitting duck at quarterback, getting after him is a big thing, and just winning the chess match, right? Between Kirk Cousins knows what the Vikings want to do on defense, the Vikings know what Kirk Cousins wants to do on offense. One of the two is going to attack the other better. The Vikings on defense need to attack Kirk better than he's able to attack them. And then shutting down the run game, also key. I'm not too concerned about that, but the Vikings have, struggled a little bit against the Cardinals. So maybe they're not quite as good as I thought they were 2 weeks ago, where they're like absolutely the best run defense in the NFL. So, obviously we'll kind of see how all that plays out. That'll kind of wrap up this episode of Kindred Skulls. So if you want to follow me, Matt Freese, you can do so at Fries Football. On Blue Sky, you can follow my co-host at Nick Olson NFL on Twitter. The podcast is at Kindred Skulls on both Twitter and Blue Sky. We're available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And by the way, that's it's like at friesfootball.bsky.social. Just kind of the weird appendage to the at. But the podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Also look us up on YouTube, Kindred Skulls. And with that, Skull Vikings.